Nuclear powers don't fight conventional wars. If you have two conventional militaries with nuclear arms behind them exchanging gunfire, you have to de-escalate that immediately. Otherwise, you can go from 0 to 60 in 20 minutes. And there's no winners from a global nuclear war.
The threat of China is the existential threat that really should, if we're going to stay up at night worrying about an existential threat, that's the one.
The Houthis themselves are sort of like North Korea. The more they can make the United States the threat, the more power they have amongst their people.
The United States lucked out and became strong in a place and in a time where it could essentially have these two massive oceans and really no regional threats. Whereas China is surrounded by regional threats.
This is how you fight modern wars.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Adventure Capitalist Podcast. In this podcast, we dive into the world of geopolitics, investing, entrepreneurship, and adventure. My name is Austin Bronner. I'm here with my co-host, Cody Shirk. What's going on, man? You are in Florida. The man who travels half the time. He's in Florida. We've pinned him down. How are you doing today?
Good. My traveling's done for a while, though. I got baby number 3 on the way.
Oh, man.
I'm going to be on lockdown for at least this summer.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's a little bit of a relief. I'm kind of burned out from traveling, especially traveling internationally. I feel like I love the world. I mean, you know, and I know you do too. I love the world, but maybe it's just me getting old, or maybe the kids. I don't know, all of it. Just I'm more excited about the U.S. right now than I am about traveling the rest of the world. It's exhausting. And yeah, it's kind of a little bit of relief, I got to say.
I feel that. Yeah, there's definitely calculus to be made with kids. It's like things that were definitely worth it in the past just aren't worth it and aren't nearly as fun. And the new things are more fun. We camped out so I talked about mini adventures, and one of the things I did last week was we just did first camping trip. My son's 2. I thought about going somewhere, but it was going to rain, so we just ended up camping in the backyard. Great experience, super fun, highly recommended.
Did you have a fire going?
We did fire. We had s'mores.
The fire's like maybe like I'm gonna say like 90% of the event
of the camping experience
for the kids.
Yeah.
For the kids, because you can cook shit, you can burn stuff, you can light things on fire. You can burn marshmallows, which then get stuck in their hair. I think I'm like, you know, when the marshmallow gets on fire and you're like, oh crap, and then you start whipping the stick around.
Yep.
And then the marshmallow like launches off, and
that's the Dennis the Menace.
Yeah. Is it? Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, this is what happened with my son, was doing that, and it flew off into my daughter's hair. And then my daughter like sees red, you know, and she's about to attack my son, but it's all like mangled in her hair. There's marshmallow, and this was in the backyard, maybe I don't know, a while ago. Luckily, I had a hose, so I just like hosed her hair out. But I'm thinking if we were in the woods, like that marshmallow would have been in there for the trip. She would have just had to have like a Bob Marley mullet, like dreadlock in the back there. But we washed it out with a hose. Anyways, like 90% of the camping is a fire. Right?
It's the fire. It's the reading books in the tent in the dark. Pretty fun. I think I slept 2 hours probably that night. He slept great, but
of course,
it was totally worth it. Totally worth it.
That's dad life and parenting life. Like when you go to the beach, when you go camping, you're just basically a glorified Sherpa. You're just carrying everything. You're cleaning everything. You're helping people go to the bathroom. You're like, there's a list of 1,000 things, and you're 1,001 on the priority list. Like your safety, hygiene, and general happiness. I shouldn't say that. You're happy doing the entire
Your happiness
time.
is an all-time high because it's so fun.
But you're working your ass off. Like it's a full-on workout. You're carrying stuff. You're like physically in pain.
And at
you're
any
mentally
time,
enjoying.
they're liable to just like, you need to be carrying them or they might fall asleep.
Yeah. Well, I'm a little bit older now. Like I kind of have the opposite problem. So my daughter's almost 8. My son's 5. Like she does not want to go to bed because she's going to miss out on something. My son's like a little bit in between. He's all right to pass out every now and then, but she does not want to go to bed. She wants to rage, which is actually a terrifying, maybe like future cast for me.
Oh yeah.
Like, oh man, why does she want to do this? Why does she want to stay up so late and party?
Somebody was saying that boys are like what is it? Boys you pay up front.
Yeah.
Girls, it's like a credit card. You pay later.
Yeah.
You know,
I can see that.
good old age 13, 14, something like that. But let's dive in. Let's dive in. We got a good episode today. Before we dive in, I just want to do a quick, how's your fitness, your 50-mile walks coming up? How you feeling?
So I've been telling you, I've been doing the beach running, soft sand running. I've been doing that my entire life. So
Yeah.
I would say I'm used to that. And
Your
the reason why I
tabs
do
are
it,
used to it.
it's really good for cardio, but it's low impact too. Because when you're stomping in the soft sand, it's low impact. Anyways, I did like a pretty long asphalt run the other day. Tore my legs up, bro. Like I feel like I got my legs beat up with a billy club. So totally my bad. I should be on the asphalt more during the walk. So I could definitely bust out a 50-mile walk right now, but it's going to be painful. I'm not gonna lie. I'm not like super pumped about the pain.
It's been a good forcing function for me when I went for a run this morning. Made things happen, and
So what distances are you putting in right now?
I'll just run for like an hour.
Okay. So what are you doing? Like
I don't
5-6
even-
miles?
I haven't even really been. Sometimes I don't even bring my phone. I just yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I just will go run for an hour and then go hike on the weekends and just do whatever. Just try to stay fit.
Because 50 miles is
10 times that.
10 times that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm not going to be. We won't be running.
Yeah. Okay. I like your.
We'll
like,
find out.
Or you're like,
We'll find out.
I like how you're like making this easier. Yeah, we're not running though, so it's easy.
But let's get into it. So the catalyst for this episode is we were talking this last week and we said to ourselves, what's an interesting thing that we both have been kind of following a little bit that we haven't talked about. And I think that there's like a general sentiment if you look both domestically and internationally, there's a feeling of unease. And, if you subscribe to the circular view of history, the fourth turning style of history kind of repeats itself and goes in these cycles. We're in a quote fourth turning, and during a fourth turning, a lot of things get reset, and they often get reset in military conflicts, or they get reset in domestic turmoil. There's lots of changes that are going on. So the catalyst for this episode is we wanted to explore the areas around the world that we look at as potential flashpoints. If you look back over 2024, there was a lot of surprising things that happened. We had a massive surprise in Syria, complete overthrow and shift in the government that happened seemingly in days. We had a crazy martial law takeover in South Korea that led to the ousting of the president. We had the Trump victory. We had Trump almost getting shot. There's just crazy things happening all over. And I mean, you can probably list one or two other ones, Cody, that were surprising from this last year.
Yeah, I mean, I would throw Ukraine in there.
Ukraine,
as well as Israel. Obviously, didn't start in 2024, but I think the public is becoming more aware that our world is becoming, I want to say less safe, but a less stable,
more volatile
place, for sure.
Yeah,
and this is, of course, we're speaking from the U.S., right? And from the U.S. perspective, we view the world obviously different than a country that's under attack or under some sort of conflict. But we're certainly much more aware that there is more possibility for volatility around the world, and our interest of where those places are, of what's next, should be, if you're an investor or a traveler or somebody who's forward-looking, should be in the back of your mind. Like, what's going to happen next? Where's the next opportunity? Where's the next risk? And if I know what's going to happen, or I think I have a good idea, how can I formulate my ideas and my next steps, knowing this information? Because the other half of all of this is that there's a lot happening that we don't know about, or that is somewhat being morphed in terms of the story that's being told to us through the mainstream media. A perfect example is Ukraine. For some people, it was very obvious that happened. Most people, especially in the West, it was a complete shock. Oh my God, how did this happen? And perhaps if we talk about some of those situations now, the next conflict or the next event that happens won't be so surprising.
Totally. At the core, that's the attempt of this episode, is to look forward and identify some of the potential conflicts that are brewing. So we, to prepare for the episode, we listed out a couple of places that we think are potentially going to pop off. And then we reached out to some interesting experts and are bringing them in. And we're going to chat through these different areas, these different flashpoints, starting with one of our repeat guests, one of our favorite guests, Professor Sean McFate. And I first stumbled across his work with a book recommendation from a friend. It's called The New Rules of War. That's his book. And as I read the book, it's called The New Rules of War, The Age of Durable Disorder. And it talks about the future of warfare and how it looks different than it has been in the last 100 years. There's been kind of a nation state view, very much led by a U.S. dominance over the last 100 years. And historically, it's been quite different than this. And his viewpoint is that it's going to shift back and we're going to move back towards an area, a world of, quote, durable disorder, which is, less focus on country lines and nation states and more focus on mercenaries, shadow war. And he just comes in with a wealth of information. I think you also read his book. And
I have it right here. I pulled off my little... This is my stack of books I've read in the past couple months. I've been doing pretty good.
There you go.
A fantastic book. It's one of those books that you told me to read it, and you start turning the pages, and the information or what he's saying is not what's being told across most channels. But when you consume it, it's very obvious, and you go, "Oh yeah, duh, this totally makes sense." And it paints the world in a picture that is completely different than maybe a lot of people look at it. But it's also pretty obvious when you look at the facts and you look at what's actually happening on the ground in a lot of these places around the world.
He's also very, very connected in Washington. He's speaking. I think he's about to go on a trip to London to go speak about what's happening in the world. I talked to my friend in the Marine Corps, and I brought his name up, and he was like, "Oh yeah, we are all reading that book. We've all read that book in the last 2 years, and it's becoming a focus of our training right now, is how to shift into this new world of mercenaries and shadow war." So,
and by the way, he's just to say real quick, he's not just a professor. He's the real deal. He was a soldier. He worked for contractors. He's been on the ground in multiple different countries, many of which he can't tell. So he's not just some professor reading some books and pontificating on some ideas. He's the real deal.
Absolute real deal. What we're super excited. We're going to dive in and talk to him about what's going on in Israel and Iran, as well as try to just get a grip on what's happening in Africa, a place that is incredibly chaotic, challenging to understand. Even if you are in Africa, it's incredibly confusing, let alone being so far removed, being in the U.S. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Sean McFate to the show. Hey, Sean, welcome back to the show. Great to have you here. Really excited. Two-time guest. We're pumped to have you back because we had so much fun the first time. And yeah, man, we were, Cody and I were talking about doing this episode, talking about some of the potential flashpoints across the globe. And we thought, let's reach out to Sean, see if he wants to hop on and share his ideas about some of the upcoming conflict zones. So welcome.
Thank you. It's so great to be back with you guys.
Well, let's dive in. Let's get right into it. Let's talk about a place that you have really spent a lot of your time thinking about. You've got a kind of a huge history in understanding the conflict in the region. And it's also right now interesting because kind of all the headlines about the Middle East have just dropped. It's not in the news the way that it was a couple of months ago, but there's still a lot of conflict going on in the Middle East between Israel and its neighbors. So why don't we dive in there and let's talk a little bit about Israel and Iran and what do you see going on right now and what is the potential escalation path here in the Middle East?
Yeah. I mean, so one reason we don't hear as much about Iran and Israel is about 6 months ago, Israel smacked Iran pretty good and hard. Well, rather, Iran has never been this low since their founding in 1979 in terms of foreign extension, maybe at the end of the Iran-Iraq War. But basically, the way Iran and Israel has been waging a shadow war for at least 10, 15 years. And the way they've been doing this is in the Levant, that's the battleground, and they always keep it beneath the threshold of global media. Because if it gets above the threshold of global media, then you have missiles flying over Jordan, and it can escalate into World War III, right? That's what happened twice last year, once in April and once again in September. And so they don't want that to happen. So the way that Iran has been fighting is by using the dark arts through proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, by their special operations units called Quds forces, by doing all sorts of other cyber crimes and stuff like that. And then Israel last year whacked Hezbollah, whacked Hamas, whacked Iran, and now they're trying to whack the Houthis. And so all these tentacles of Iran have been chopped off. And Iran is also in a very brittle state internally because of the not just the sanctions, but the Middle East itself has aligned itself more with Israel than with Iran. So this is all, and with Donald Trump in office, Iran is in the back corner, and that's why we're not hearing from them. But they haven't gone away. That's the big problem.
So we were excited to talk to you again because, as Austin said, we were talking about what's next in the world, what's going to break out. We said we got to talk to Sean because he's going to tell us where we probably aren't paying attention to, but there's a high likelihood of being conflict. So with specifically the Houthis right now, which is they're in Yemen. It's clear that Iran's backing them. And the U.S. we're bombing them right now as we speak. And it's not really making the news. But the reason why we're doing this, and I'm saying this from the media side or from the U.S., what they're saying is because the Houthis are attacking ships. And that's interrupting international trade, but it's also interrupting U.S. operations in the region. So they're a direct threat. This isn't like we're just randomly bombing them. They are attacking ships. Iran is clearly backing the Houthis. So as far as a short term or a conflict that could happen in this region, do you see Iran becoming much more stronger there, or do you think they'll continue to back off? Where is Iran going to go in this short term area? They're getting desperate, right? Their economy's starting to fail more.
So they're getting desperate, and desperate times lead to desperate measures. So there's two areas that Iran, one is the Houthis, but one is also Syria. So remember that Syria, it was the Alawite regime was a proxy in many ways of Iran. They were Shia in a Sunni-dominated country, and that imploded last year. And how it imploded is an interesting story as well. But who fills that vacuum is one question. And also the Houthis. Because remember, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states were already at war there earlier. So Iran is fully isolated geopolitically, financially, diplomatically, militarily. But the Houthis, they just launched a ballistic missile at the Ben Gurion airport in Tel Aviv just a few days ago. So, and the Houthis themselves are quite good at taking technology that's sent to them from Iran and jury-rigging it and using it quite efficiently, and they still need Iran's backing, and we're trying to cut that off. But the Houthis themselves are sitting on piles of conventional weapons, and their whole ideology as a governing regime is sort of like North Korea. The more they can make the United States the threat, the more power they have amongst their people. So they create this BS narrative that it's like the world against them, and only this government can save Sana'a and others. And we also need to do some strategic information operations on the ground to convince them that what's keeping them back is this vile regime that's taken over. So it's not, we can try to bomb them into oblivion, and I think we should bomb them into Stone Age, up into Stone Age, as some people say. But I think we need to do some other things too. And we don't have to do nation building or anything like that. We just need them to stop.
But do you think Iran will step in soon to escalate? Or at what point do you think Iran will either back off or escalate? Considering what's going on with the U.S. and the Houthis in Yemen right now.
Well, I think if we tie it to whatever negotiations we have to Iran, they might consider it. But right now, there's no incentive for them to stop. Also, proxies have a way of doing things that the puppet masters sometimes don't approve. So it's hard to control the Houthis. They're not like we always think of proxies as being puppeteers or whatever, but they're not. They have their own interests, and they can do things that Tehran doesn't want them to do. They can act as a spoiler, in fact, if Tehran gets into a negotiating agreement with the United States and others that put their interests at risk. They can try to spoil that.
Is that Iran's ultimate goal, though, is to get something from the U.S.? Obviously, they want to lax on the nuclear deal. They want a lot of things, but I guess we're not hearing a lot from Iran and the U.S., or at least it's not being disclosed to the public.
Yeah.
Them pushing for something, we don't really know yet, right? What they really want. They obviously want more freedom. They want the sanctions backed off and all that. I'm just curious, that catalyst that will make something happen in the near term. You're saying that it's going to stay status quo for a while, I guess is what you're going to say.
I think that there are discussions happening.
Okay.
They're not just binary or bilateral between the U.S. and Yemen. I think they involve the U.S., Israel, and the Gulf states.
Okay.
And they're keeping it on the down low because it's still probably all the Venn diagrams are still kind of far apart. And what, Saudi has to live with it. Israel has to live with it. We have to live with it. The EU has to live with it. Plus you have tensions between the US and the EU. We have like JD Vance saying, "Oh, why don't you have a navy? Why don't you do this? Since we're doing this mostly for your economy." So there's a lot of, this is a multi-party negotiation, and there's a lot of rife within it. But in terms of a point of moving them, I think if it was up to me, the U.S. should invest in more dark art stuff in Iran to get to separate the people from their regime more and more. This is a theocracy that's an autocracy combined, right? So to some extent, like all autocracies, Tehran doesn't really care about the people. But if you can create factions between the IRCG, the mullahs, and the people, and I think there's ways we could do that, we make them less stable, which can make them more dangerous, but I think it also makes them more susceptible to a position of negotiation that I think we'd like to see. The problem is they are getting very close to nuclear weapons, and maybe we just, do we have to take action against that? And that's a big thorny topic.
One question I've got.
Yeah.
Trump rode into office on one part of his narrative as being a peacemaker, right? Especially in Ukraine. And then you've got kind of the second conflict, which he's not, let's just put him this way, from the perspective of somebody observing through the media, the way that he speaks about peace in Ukraine is different than the way that he speaks about peace in the Middle East. And it seems like the alignment with Israel is much tighter than definitely than what's happening in Ukraine. And it seems like there's a couple of pitfalls or some landmines that could be stepped on that could lead to more conflict and an escalation there. What do you see as the biggest tripwires or landmines that the U.S. could step on that would lead to an escalation between Israel and Iran that we don't want to hit, but they're kind of floating out there and they could be activated?
Well, I think we need to keep the shadow war between Israel and Iran in the shadows, because once it pops above the shadows, then Go back to last fall when you had or last April, we had missiles. You know, when you fight in the shadows, it provides leaders secret off ramps to escalation. So if Israel wipes out a bunch of Iranians in Syria or vice versa, both sides can say nothing to see here. We really don't want to escalate this. Let's keep it where it is. Okay. But if it's out in the public, if Iran fires missiles, then Bibi has to do something to keep credibility both domestically and abroad. And the same thing goes with Tehran. So what we need to do is keep the fighting under the threshold of the public attention span, not the intelligence communities. They know what's going on. But once it makes, CNN and Fox and the BBC and whatever, then it changes the dynamics of the politics, and credibility is king. And then suddenly you have to do reprisals, and that can lead up the escalation ladder. So I think what's true, whether it's Iran or Taiwan or any place else, Pakistan, India, you name it, is we have to keep, with these nuclear powers, you have to remember that nuclear powers don't fight conventional wars, right? That's what the Cuban Missile Crisis taught us. If you have two conventional militaries with nuclear arms behind them in a war, in a grid square, exchanging gunfire, you have to de-escalate that immediately. Otherwise, that gunfire will lead to nuclear weapons. You can go from 0 to 60 in 20 minutes, and there's no winners from a global nuclear war. It's the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, what I'm most scared of is accidental nuclear war in the Persian Gulf. Some of our early Burks get into a fighting match, or fighter planes get into a shooting match, and it kind of overcomes events where it escalates quicker than the chief commands in Tehran and Washington D.C. can squelch it. And that's true for the South China Sea. It's true for Pakistan and India. It's runaway nuclear warfare.
That's a bad situation. Well, let's hope it doesn't get to that ever, but especially soon in that region. Can we shift over to the Sahel region, Austin? Are you good with that?
I want to switch there. I want to ask one clarifying or one follow-up question about Syria.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned that as an area where there's potential for Iran kind of filling the vacuum there. And you touched a little bit on you said there was an interesting transition that happened there. The way that it became, basically the way that Syria fell, had a lot of, give us kind of a quick primer on what happened and why you consider it to be an interesting way that Syria fell.
Yeah, well, one thing that the fall of Syria in 2025 took a lot of Middle East experts by surprise, and Syria experts, right? And what was why then and there? And one of the reasons is because Ukraine is trying to create dumpster fires for Russia abroad, so that Russia has to take troops out of Ukraine to deal with them. So in November of 2024, Ukraine sent in a tight group of a unit with drones to help and teach the Islamic terrorists, for lack of a better word, how to use and fight them. And they did, and that helped lead to the quick fall of the Alawite regime, creating a strategic emergency for Russia because they had to bring in Bashir. And this is an example of how modern war is fought. You fight using the dark arts under the table to create strategic dumpster fires for your adversary. And that is part of the story of Syria's fall.
Very interesting. Not something that is reported on in headlines.
Yeah.
Ukraine's involved.
Ukraine's done a lot of weird stuff. Yeah.
Let's make a quick transition to another area that has some brewing conflict. That's the Sahel block. Why don't we just talk, what is the Sahel block? Who is involved, and why is there so much conflict and escalating conflict going on in that part of Africa?
Yeah. So the Sahel, if you imagine the Sahara Desert that goes across the one of the top, close to the top band of Africa, and separates North Africa from the sub-Saharan part of Africa. The Sahel is that zone where it goes from desert to sort of jungle. It's like this arid thing. There's plants there, there's people there. And that has been, during the colonial years, was all French. And when the French left the Sahel, when the French left their colonies in Africa and other places around the world, unlike the United Kingdom and other places like Spain and Portugal, they kept on meddling in the affairs of former colonies. And this really angered all those colonies. And then it became a bigger issue when uranium was discovered in Chad and Niger. And of course, France, besides nuclear weapons, like 80% or 75% of its electrical grid is run on nuclear power. And so we had a lot of heavy-handed meddling in the Sahel countries like Mali and Niger and Chad, and they all hate France. And the UN got involved, and that became a big problem. And then what happened after that, around 2017, is Russia got involved. They sent the Wagner Group down there as a secret, sort of like under Prigozhin, who owned the group. And he's no mercenary; he's like a business guy. And he did something I call the Prigozhin model, which has worked. He's an opportunist. He finds a regime in peril, or he finds coup makers. And the case of like Mali or someplace else, he says, "Look, I will go to you and I will help I will help kick the French out and put your guy in charge. I will then use my mercenary muscle of the Wagner Group to coup-proof you. In exchange, and also I'll use my troll factories to politically assassinate online your opposition, France, etc. Now, I want two things in exchange for this. One is I want access to your gold mines, diamond mines, oil, whatever natural resources, and we'll split the profits." And he also owns mining companies and oil companies, so it's something Prigozhin could do. And also, I want you to be basically a client state for Moscow. And Moscow will give you top cover in the United Nations, but you're now Moscow facing and not West facing. And of course they're like, fine, we hate Paris. And this model worked very well. And you've seen Russia sort of take over much of the Sahel where France once was. Now you see Russian influence. It hasn't been perfect, and there's been problems like in the CAR, but you've seen France get kicked out, and you've seen this scramble for rare earth minerals and gold, because one of the ways that Putin funded his war in Ukraine is by smuggling hundreds of millions of dollars, probably, of gold out of the Sahel through Dubai and into Moscow, totally busting all sanctions.
So in the Sahel region specifically, you mentioned uranium, and we've talked about this before, specifically how France had a mine in Mali where 20% of all their uranium they're using annually came from this one mine. It was state-run, the French state-run Orano Group, and the Mali took it back, of course, with the support of the Wagner Group. And France, more or less, wove the white flag, very French-like. That's a little French joke in there. But this is a pretty big shift, meaning that Western Europe, specifically France, is losing access to these minerals. The U.S. also left out of there. And we know the U.S. is involved more in Southern Africa. But for the Sahel region specifically, is the West just going to give up, you think? Do you think we're going to go back in there and push our influence around? Or what catalysts in there could happen in the short term to switch the direction that clearly the Sahel region is going more towards Russia?
Yeah, I think the West, and mainly France, has overplayed its hand for generations. And this is what they've reaped. The UN has left there. Remember, France is on the council, Security Council. And I think that there's a lot of malcontent towards the West and towards France. And of course, the US would go in there too and say, look, we'll give you all this money, but you've got to do elections our way. And we're going to meddle in your politics too. And they're tired of all that. We did have a pretty big counterterrorism base in North Niger that we've lost. But you could argue our CT mission in the Sahel is kind of a legacy mission anyway, and maybe it's time to leave anyway. But I think I think with the West, if it's interested in the Sahel, the only way to deal with it, the first way to deal with it, is to try to create dissent against Russia there. I mean, Russia is no saint. And the Wagner Group has committed alleged human rights crimes, and all the wealth that France was sucking out of Mali is now being sucked into Russia. So they've traded one master for another imperial master. So if there's ways that we can use information campaigns and to do irregular warfare things to help create that cleavage, we can start to get Russia out of there on their own sort of natural weight.
And to make it even more confusing, I think recently in Mali, I think the Ukrainians supported the Tigres, which is the nomadic group from Algeria, to come in, and I think they massacred the Wagner Group, one of the biggest massacres they've experienced in a long time. But this is more proof that this is an area that is very much on the edge, and almost all sides of the world are poking in this area to create conflict.
Well, remember, Ukraine for the last year, at least, they've been fighting this black on black war with Russia, whether that's, in Syria, whether that's sabotaging Russia's defense industrial base in deep Russia, whether that's hiring mercenaries to go after Wagner Group mercenaries, as they've been doing in Africa. This is how you fight modern wars. You try to create so many problems for your adversaries abroad that they get so distracted and they get resource depleted that their main effort against you has to take a back seat. And so, yes, in Mali, we did have a massacre. I forget how many Wagner Group guys, but quite a few, get whacked. But, that's not going to stop the Wagner Group. I mean, also, let's not forget, the Wagner Group, after Prigozhin got killed in August of, quote unquote, we don't really know. He could be on a yacht in the Caribbean with a Mai Tai and a beard. We just don't know. So Russia came down to nationalize the Wagner Group. All of the Wagner Group's best fighters were always in Africa. They were never in Ukraine. Ukraine for them was like Stalingrad, a pointless battle. And that's where they dumped all those prisoners as quote unquote Wagner Group guys. They were just prisoners. I used to talk to Wagner Group guys, and they hated those guys as besmirching their Wagner Group brand. It's kind of amazing. All the best guys, which means like the ex-paratroopers, Spetsnaz, all those like assault professional military guys, were in Africa guarding Prigozhin's interests. After Prigozhin disappeared, Russia sent in January last year, 2024, a guy from the Ministry of Defense saying, hey, here, we're changing your name to Africa Corps, sign this piece of paper of loyalty, and you work for us. But that's not, these are mercenaries. They'll sign that piece of paper, and as long as you keep the money going, that's good. They'll stick around. But, as soon as they feel like they don't need to, they will leave. And so the question is, where will they end up at?
Quick question about the Wagner Group. You said you've spoken to them. What's the percentage of the Wagner Group that's Russian? Like, is it 90%? Is it like...
We don't know. I mean, it's mostly Russian, but that's all from the former Soviet Union orbits.
So they had Stan fighters.
Stans. We also had a lot of Balkans. We had their own Serbian unit where the command language was Serbian. But basically, sort of Warsaw Pact countries, Soviet countries, they all fought according to Soviet doctrine, military doctrine.
And then, so in the region, right, there's been kind of a series of coups over the last 3-4 years.
Yeah.
In Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and you've got also ECOWAS. Can you give kind of a breakdown on like the conflict and the pathway to escalation between the countries surrounding the area and the newly let's just say like semi-aligned, unstable countries, what is the potential like larger conflict, and where can this go if it continues down a pathway of escalation?
Well, one of the problems about Africa, and I spent many years there fighting in African wars, is that the boundaries that we see in Africa, those state boundaries don't reflect actual natural political entities. They were artificially imposed in the 1880s in a bunch of Berlin conferences between European great powers, divvying up Africa the same way Sykes-Picot did in 1916 with the Middle East. And one of the tricks that the colonialists did, is they put, if there's a strong ethnic group, they'll put a boundary right in the middle to split it up. You're in this country, you're in that country. Think of the Durand Line in Afghanistan, Pakistan, right? It's a way of control. And, it's not really, you can't take a state-centric perspective when you do conflict analysis in Africa. You have to look at ethnic group, tribal groups, and you still have all the Tigray and Ethiopians, as you were discussing. You have the Tuareg in northern Mali versus the sub-Sahara parts of Mali. You have the Darfur in West Sudan versus the civil war right now in Sudan, and that's one place that could grow. It's a civil war in Sudan, and that's curiously enough where Russia has backed both sides, and they're trying to play it on the down low. You have all sorts of these problems all across Africa and the CAR. What I think you're going to see is Africa is not going to get stronger in the decades to come. It's going to remain enfeebled, frankly, by ethnic groups, warlords, stuff like that. But what's going to be added to it is the growing prevalence of mercenaries. And I don't just mean land mercenaries. I mean like cyber. I mean, you name it, and also rare earth minerals, because what I believe is that what oil was to the 20th century, rare earths are becoming to the 21st century because they power green technology, every computer chip, quantum mechanics, all that's quantum computing, and we don't have enough of it. And it's finite. And right now, the only places that really have a lot of it are under war zones like in Africa and Afghanistan.
So we talked about this months ago before Trump came in office. The U.S. has been backing the Lobito corridor, which is this railway out of more south of the Sahel region. This is in the Congo area. We're trying to get rare earths out of the middle of Africa to the port of Lobito in Namibia, in what country is it there? What's right above Namibia? Come on, guys, help me here.
Angola.
Angola, there you go. And this railway is going from the middle of Africa out to the port there in Angola. Trump came in, and I think a lot of people thought, we're going to back off this. He doesn't want to do these international wars. But the U.S. State Department just announced that they are not only continuing with this Lobito project, but they're actually increasing its importance because of the rare earth access in the middle there. And then just to the north there, you have Russia again pushing its influence, and it's pretty clear that some conflict may erupt there, and it's even scary that the U.S. has strong interest there. So do you see that as a major part of conflict in Africa as well?
I think that in terms of great power competition, I think China's Belt Road Initiative in Africa, Russia's ongoing mercenary influence in pirate mining, and American demand for these minerals is going to, and plus all those, fragile and failed states, and let's be honest about it, they're totally opportunist. That's going to be like El Paso in 1870, right? And yes, I do think there's going to be wars. Now, one of the problems, I'm a bit skeptical about this railroad. Building railroads in Africa has long been a noble idea that's ended in tears, from Cecil Rhodes to the Chinese in Tanzania in the early 1970s to today. And, that's what we need. But it's like building a railroad through Afghanistan would be easier and safer. And I don't, and then also think about this: who's going to go in and secure and mine all that? No American company will because of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which says no bribery. Well, that's how the economy is run there. It's totally on bribery. And who's going to secure all those mines? Not the local corrupt Democratic Republic Congo army. No, they're terrible. It's going to be a warlord group. No, they're going to hire mercenaries. And so we're going to start to see what I believe is ex-Wagner Group guys starting to work with pirate mining companies to extract cobalt and other rare earth minerals from the worst parts of Africa. And the U.S. will then buy it from them, right? And so it's still a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act thing. So we've got to do some thinking about how do we secure this critical supply chain? And let's not forget that China owns the bulk of most critical rare earth supply ore in the world under its soil. So, we'll see where this railroad goes, but I do think that the worst place in the world, which is the Central African regions and the Great Lakes region of Africa, will be a spark and flashpoint for great power competition.
And then when we kind of dive into on a larger level, before we let you go here, on a larger level, you've seen a shift in the, let's just say, consensus view of Americans towards more of this America First agenda. And it's in a way that I think is a little bit more durable than it has in the past. You've got most Americans aligned with this idea that we need to pull back from some of the international conflict. What do you see as the second order consequence of this shift? Do you see, is that a positive in terms of, conflict abroad, or is this going to lead to a surprising increase in conflict that the average American isn't going to expect?
I think first of all, the move towards strategic restraint is important. The U.S., did expeditionary warfare in the name of democracy in the Balkans in the 1990s, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, all over the world. And all we did is kill Americans, waste trillions of dollars, and besmirch the name of democracy. We are facing a world that's very cynical about democracy. Mm-hmm. And a lot of questions are now being asked, rightfully so, from veterans. Why did especially when Afghanistan fell and the way it fell, what was that all about? I think those are legitimate questions to ask. And I do think it's okay. I think J.D. Vance is not wrong when he says, why are we spending our Navy protecting Europe's main economic lifeline from Asia? Why don't they get more involved? I don't think those are wrong questions to ask. I do think that there will be more conflict in the world as well. I mean, so there'll be less conflict. We're not going to do boots in the ground like Iraq, right? But there'll be more conflict in places as well. And I think, frankly, that's the history of the world. I call it durable disorder. It's, world will look more disorderly. It won't just be states who make all the decisions. It'll be a combination of multinational corporations, super rich individuals like Elon Musk, other actors as well. And I do think that we will find a way. I mean, in the Middle Ages was like this, and it wasn't like the sky was falling. We had to invest in more sky for lack of a strong state system. The pendulum's going back to normal, where you don't have a strong state system, which could exert a lot of good force, but also exert a lot of bad force. Yeah. I mean, World War I and World War II, the deadliest wars in history, that was a result of a strong state system. And I think we're going to get into more of a durable disorder with constant low-grade conflict going on. And do all Americans need to worry and concern about? I don't think so. If they do, then they're welcome to join like United Nations or something like that. But I'm not sure that America has to be the global cop for world peace, if that's even feasible or desirable.
Totally. And yeah, when we say global peace, it's like we've been at war for
right. Global war and terror, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sean, thank you for hopping on with us. I know Cody has your book right here.
Thank you, Cody.
New Rules
Yeah,
of
if you're
War.
listening to this, definitely get the book, The New Rules of War by Dr. Sean McFate. Excellent read. It's a pretty quick read, to be honest with you. I mean, it's not a short book, but you get into it and you're like, I got to finish this within like a day or two because this is need to know information, and it helps you understand where the world's going and make some better investment decisions, maybe life decisions, and just get a bigger picture idea of what's actually going on. So fantastic book. Go buy this book for sure.
Thanks, Cody. It's also an Audible, and I'm working on the sequel to the book right now. It's right now called The Dark Arts, How to Undermine Autocracies and Avoid World War III. It's a working title, but it basically says, let's fight sneaky and not hard.
Dumpster fire wars, right?
Yes.
That's
The
all. That's
dumpster
the
fire
alternative
strategy.
working title.
Exactly.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Cody.
much.
Thank you, Austin.
Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Yeah, super fascinating stuff from Sean. I think my biggest takeaway is that we don't know what the hell is going on in Africa.
You know, it's funny. We've talked about Africa so many times, and one of the things we've talked about is the demographics there, where the demographics there is growing at a breakneck pace. And we've talked about, hey, if a country doesn't have enough infrastructure, you're going to have a lot of youth that aren't going to have jobs, and what are they going to do? And then hearing what Sean has to say is like, oh man, this complicates things exponentially. And now that Russia, China, the U.S., and pretty much every Western nation needs minerals out of Africa, it's going to be an interesting future there.
It is. Yeah, I mean, what do those people do? Go to war.
Yeah,
Go
well,
to war.
they join an alliance. I don't know what alliance they're going to join, but there's so many alliances there that it's pretty clear that the influences from these other mega nations, China, Russia, even parts of Europe coming into Africa, they're going to pick and pull, and they got to choose which side they're going to be on. Or they're going to force to, when I say they, people in Africa are going to be forced to choose which side treats them best on the ground.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how much of our media reports on what's going on in the Middle East. Not much in Africa. It really doesn't like go above the line. Often it's just hijacked by other higher priority things. But one area that has been just top of mind has been Asia, right? We talked, the Obama administration, quote, pivoted to Asia. There's a lot of change happening in Asia. So the next section of this episode, we want to dive into and go kind of deep into what is happening in Asia, specifically the Indo-Pacific. So our next guest, his name is Ray Powell, and he is the host of the podcast, Why Should You Care About the Indo-Pacific? He also writes at a company called Sea Light, which they basically just report on gray zone warfare. And what that means is like war that is not war happening in the Indo-Pacific and specifically in the South China Sea. So we're going to dive in, talk to Ray, and get his thoughts on some of the potential conflicts coming up in the Pacific. So let's welcome Ray to the show. Ray, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here, Austin. Thanks.
Where are we recording from?
So I am in California where I live. I kind of have a very busy travel schedule, so I go back and forth to Asia quite a bit because of the work that I do.
I imagine there's lots of time spent in the Indo-Pacific. I want to dive in. So I prepared for this episode, reading some of your website about Sea Light and then listening to your podcast. My first question is, why should we care about the Indo-Pacific?
Wow, that's almost like it's exactly the name of my podcast. So please like, subscribe, and tell all your friends. Well, why should we care? So the Indo-Pacific, we as the United States have been trying to recognize the importance of the Indo-Pacific for, really since the Obama administration. There was a very public push to, quote, pivot, or then the later word was rebalance to the Indo-Pacific. And, there's a couple obvious reasons. The largest economies besides the United States, all the emerging ones are in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, the threat of China is the existential threat that really should, if we're going to stay up at night worrying about an existential threat, that's the one. And that's the one that people in Washington, D.C. worry about. It's, they are the closest thing we have to a peer competitor. They are increasingly aggressive, and their ambitions are now sort of out in the open. They are acting on their ambitions. They are pushing out into the space that is occupied and needed and legitimately belongs to very, very close U.S. allies like South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. So that's where the world should be paying attention. But you know what? It's the funny thing is that things keep dragging us back to Europe and the Middle East, so it's very hard to keep the focus.
For the purpose of this podcast, our goal, what we've been talking about, has been what are the next global flashpoints, right? There's a lot of surprises that happened in 2024. A lot of things that I don't think many people saw coming. A lot of them happened. Some of them happened in the Middle East, and then there was a lot of really surprising stuff that happened in the Pacific. Things happening in South Korea, massive change, disruption, lots of new news of shifting in Australia, the Philippines. But the big one that most Americans hear about on a consistent basis is what's happening in the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan, China. Now I'm going to simplify it, but the general message that is received through the mainstream media in the US is China bad, Taiwan is free, China wants Taiwan, and there's some entanglement with the US, and the US doesn't want China to get Taiwan. And I would say that that's the general simplified message that reaches people in the US. What is going on in Taiwan? What's the history behind Taiwan and China that is important but does not reach the US, the mainstream audience?
Yeah, so I think the thing that people should be really concerned about regarding Taiwan, and the thing that keeps me up at night, as it were, is not the threat of invasion, although, of course, that is a huge threat and one that we should take extremely seriously, and one that we should be spending a lot more of our time preparing for, because it is a non-zero chance of happening, and the prospects, if it were to happen, the outcomes could be cataclysmic, right? I mean, it could put the United States in a shooting war with a nuclear power. That's enough to just sort of make you stop and take notice. I am one of those who believes that China really, really, really does not want to have to invade Taiwan, and their primary strategy remains to convince Taiwan somehow to give up its sovereignty and simply allow China to have it. So this is maybe what you might think of as the Hong Kong model. Obviously, it's a different situation. Hong Kong was an easier get than Taiwan for China. But China does believe in the model. That's why it has sort of perfected the art. It's become the most sophisticated gray zone operator the world has ever seen, in essentially using all elements of national power to get what it wants. And so I just think that China still sees a future in which Taiwan sort of falls off the tree and it doesn't have to go be picked.
So we've talked on this podcast multiple times about China does these non-war strategies. We know very well what's going on in the South China Sea with them building up these military bases, but prior to the military bases, they're doing fishing around them, or they're kind of excluding these little pieces of land from other countries that are maybe a part of other countries, and it becomes this big dispute. We've even talked about the international fishing fleet that China has, and they're sending around the world. They have fishing fleets off the coast of South America. And a lot of these movements that China is doing have to do with like non-military boats and non-military, let's call it almost diplomacy. And they kind of send these people out there first, and then they slowly ratchet it up. So right now, what is happening in this region that you can point to and say, this is what China is doing, this is their strategy, and this is why we should be concerned?
And you've teed me up for that perfectly. You've clearly been reading the latest posts on the blog. So Scarborough Shoal. Scarborough Shoal is a feature about 120 nautical miles off the coast of Luzon in the Philippines. It is within the Philippines exclusive economic zone, but it is the subject of a territorial dispute between the Philippines and China. And I say territorial because it meets the definition of territory. It is above water at all times, even at high tide. So under international laws, it is considered territory. China seized it in 2012 in what was kind of a big deal for the Philippines and a kind of a low moment for U.S.-Philippine relations because the U.S. really didn't have a great response. In fact, many Filipinos would look at it and say the U.S. actually kind of helped China just by, doing the bad diplomacy and sort of giving China time to consolidate the seizure of Scarborough Shoal. So in the meantime, what then happened is China began to aggressively allow its giant clam harvesting ships to go to Scarborough Shoal and began to highly regulate Philippine fishermen, the artisanal, traditional fisher folks in their little wooden boats. They ran into more and more trouble getting into the shoal, which was a big deal for Philippine food security, fishing villages all up and down the coast. What's happened recently is that in the last year we've seen a spike, basically a doubling of Chinese security vessels. I call them essentially paramilitary. So this is the China Coast Guard, which operates extremely large vessels meant to essentially assert Chinese sovereignty, and what we call the maritime militia, which are fishing vessels that don't fish. They've got very reinforced hulls. They've got very clean decks because there are never any fish on them. But they help the Chinese Coast Guard screen other countries out of places they don't want them to be. And so they have been at Scarborough Shoal for a long time, regulating traffic in and out of the shoal. But now they've essentially locked the Philippines out, and we've heard we basically documented. And this is up on the blog right now, one of our top stories. We've documented the fact that the Philippine Coast Guard, the Philippine fisheries enforcement vessels can no longer get anywhere close to it, like 25 nautical miles from the shoal. There's basically a cordon around the shoal. They can't get in. And even the fishermen themselves are having a hard time getting in. So China is essentially taking the shoal by force just simply by denying the Philippines access.
So there's this classic map that many people have seen where it's this dotted line that China has drawn around many different, let's call them outposts, but they're, like you said, they're these islands or these masses of land that only appear during low tide throughout the South China Sea. And this is the area where a lot of other countries are saying, hey, this is not your land, China. But China is slowly taking over through this non-war initiative. So the fear from the West, the U.S. specifically, but also for the Philippines, for Japan, for Taiwan, is that these are not Chinese military vessels. They're a Coast Guard or these fisher boats. And what you're saying is these boats are basically setting up a precedent for China to eventually say, this is ours. We're fishing here. We have our infrastructure there. No one else is coming in. And that is a major threat for all of these countries in the area. Is that a right assumption?
Yeah, I mean, so what you're talking about is the 9-dash line, which is commonly called. Now, the number of dashes changes over the years. It started as the 11-dash line, and by many accounts, it's now the 10-dash line because they put an extra one around Taiwan for the heck of it. But yes, in fact, the Vietnamese call it the cow's tongue because they basically look at China as being the cow and then this huge tongue coming down to lick up the entire South China Sea. But it is essentially 90% of the South China Sea, which is a massive body of water, twice as big as the Gulf of Mexico. Is huge, and it is a huge shipping lane. Essentially, a third of the world's commerce goes through the South China Sea. So for China to essentially own it is a huge deal. And of course, what it does is it establishes a new kind of access or anti-access area denial zone in which China would be able to sort of keep others out, and of course it has in mind the United States. So China is pushing out. Interestingly, you mentioned these vessels. You know, when you talk about the fishing vessels, one of the things that we noted very recently is that the clam harvesting at Scarborough Shoal seems to have stopped. Now, giant clam harvesting is an extremely destructive activity. You basically have to take a reef apart to get to the clamshells that you want to sell in China to people who like clamshell jewelry, clamshell statuettes, those kinds of things. They're very highly valued in China. And so this harvesting has been going on for a long time and has essentially wiped out a lot of what Scarborough Shoal used to be for fishermen in the South China Sea. So, you know, it's no longer able to do what it used to do, which was an extremely important job just in the overall food security of the region. Now, what was interesting is last summer, China issued a very nice report saying we have investigated Scarborough Shoal and the quality there is excellent. It's used the word excellent. At the same time, it pulled all the clam harvesters out. So for us, the logical conclusion is that they are lying and the shoal quality is not excellent, but something very much less than excellent. And that's why all the clam harvesters had to finally leave. Now, China still can't let anybody else in because then, of course, somebody else would find out what's not excellent there. But Scarborough Shoal is also extremely important just as terrain because it's very close to Manila. It's sort of the closest thing to Manila that China could, if it decided to, build a structure on. And the Philippines is now called that would be a red line for them.
When you say red line for the Philippines, what does it actually mean?
Yeah, that's always the question, right? Is the question for what does anybody mean when they say red line? You can go back years. You can go back to Barack Obama in Syria in 2012, and what did he mean by red line then? So I think we all struggle with that. There were discussions, back last summer when there was all the activity around another shoal, Second Thomas Shoal, where the old Philippine rusty ship is the outpost out there. And President Marcos essentially said that if a Philippine sailor died in one of these water cannon ramming events that were happening all the time, that would be, quote, an act of war, which sounded a lot like a red line. So, nobody knows what red line means for any, and honestly, I'm not sure even the Philippines knows exactly what it means, but it would be a cataclysmic event for them because it would essentially set up a Chinese outpost very close to the Philippine mainland and very close to the Philippine capital.
So as we're seeing this unfold, I think it's tempting to get sucked in on these little tiny skirmishes or this little tiny island here or there. And what you mentioned just a moment ago was this is a major shipping lane, correct?
Yeah.
So we all know what's going on off the coast of Yemen right now with the threat of the Houthis attacking ships. They're attacking a waterway that's very important for Europe, very important for the rest of the world. We all know what was going on in the Panama Canal with the U.S. wanting to take back over, I won't say control, but at least influence. And the bigger picture here is this struggle for who's going to control the world shipping lane. So this is a major concern to the West. And I don't want to say U.S. or Chinese apologists want to justify China's activities here, but this is a much bigger picture that if we continue to let it go, when I say we, the West and the U.S., let China continue to take over this area, they could really put us in a bad situation for global trade in the future.
Yeah, so people say, the term of art is freedom of navigation. And the term, the freedom of navigation, the U.S. has a very odd relationship to the freedom of navigation. On one hand, we depend on it entirely. We really need there to be, freedom of the seas, freedom of navigation, so that ships, commerce can flow freely. And so any threat to the freedom of navigation in one place has very big impacts to the United States. Regardless of whatever else is going on in Washington, D.C., we remain a country that's highly dependent on commerce. And the interesting thing is there was a international convention called the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea that was passed, it was passed in 1982. Various countries, including China, have ratified it. The U.S., because of weird Washington, D.C. politics, never did. But we have become its foremost advocate, and we not only abide by it, but we actively assert it. We have things called freedom of navigation operations, where anytime we have a country that has an excessive claim that goes beyond what's in that UN convention, we intentionally send a warship to go right by there to make sure everybody knows that we don't recognize those excessive claims. And a whole bunch of them are in the South and East China Seas, especially the South China Sea. And so we are constantly doing these freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, challenging the excessive claims, of which China has a lot. So why do we care so much now? Well, China is now, as we speak, restricting other countries' freedom of navigation, especially the Philippines. So by establishing a cordon, for example, 25 nautical miles out from Scarborough Shoal, well, that's twice the distance of a territorial sea, which would be what Scarborough Shoal would earn if we were to grant China, their point that they own it, which we don't. But even if we did, what we're seeing now is China restricting the Philippines' freedom of navigation. They've done that throughout the South China Sea. So what's to stop them from doing it as they gain more and more control to other countries, to other ships? What if they began to start, for example, maybe we don't like liquid natural gas going in Taiwan. Maybe we'll just start intercepting those ships and turning them around if we don't think that they're obeying all of our Chinese laws. What if, because the way that they interpret their laws, they apply to essentially everything around their whole 9 or 10 dash line.
So for this episode, we talked a little bit about, we've been talking about flashpoints and surprises. What do you see going forward as maybe some of the potential conflict starters, the potential tripwires that would lead to a larger conflict escalation in, let's just say, the whole, Indo-Pacific region? Yeah. What are the keys that you see that you're like, this could be a surprise that we see in the next couple of years?
Well, so let's begin with the fact that the United States has 5 Indo-Pacific treaty alliances. So the ones I already mentioned, South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, along with Australia and Thailand. Those first 3, of course, are in kind of the hot zones. Those are the places where most of the action is happening now. It also has not a treaty alliance, but public law concerning Taiwan that says that we are at least going to assist Taiwan to defend itself. Whether or not we would come to Taiwan's aid in a particular contingency has always been left ambiguous, and there was reasons for that, right? On one hand, sort of not trying to provoke China, but at the same time trying to deter China by giving them something to think about. When I think about these things, I think less, believe it or not, about what's going to start a war, because I really don't think China wants to go to war. I think what would provoke a crisis, and a crisis really beginning with, in Washington, D.C., the decision is, what are we going to do if this thing happens? So let's go back to the idea we talked about before. What would the United States do if all of a sudden China decided to start inspecting liquid natural gas vessels going into Taiwan? Taiwan is almost entirely dependent on imported energy. It's an island. It doesn't have a bunch of energy of its own, so it has to bring it all in by ship. So what would we do? Would we go to war? Well, China probably thinks we probably wouldn't go to war just because they're stopping shipping going into Taiwan. What would we do? Would we, enact embargoes? Would we? So, and then what if China didn't stop all of the ships? They just stopped 1, and then next month they stopped 2, and then over time, in their typical style, they slice the salami. They take a little slice this month and another slice next month and another slice next month. And pretty soon we have woken up into a world where they have basically taken a whole, most of the salami, and we didn't really do anything because we didn't have a plan for that. That's what worries me.
Yeah, it's very interesting because that does not, like I was saying, it doesn't really reach the average reporting from in the U.S. about the conflict in Taiwan and China, right? It's like it's always framed in this perspective of like war or no war, right? And it's just not the reality.
And
I wanna
yet,
move- go ahead.
Austin, we have 3 decades or more of evidence that this is exactly China's game playbook. This is exactly how they do it.
It's also the different way that we think, especially in the U.S. We think in 4-year cycles, maybe an 8-year cycle of a presidency versus, the Chinese, which is thinking in generations. I always get corrected to don't think of China as a country, but as a civilization. And it's a completely different thought process for how we think they're going to act versus what they think we're going to do.
Well, the other thing that's different and something that they take great advantage of is that we think that there are these civilian things over here and these military things over here, and those two things shouldn't touch each other. And we have a lot of our own laws that say that should not happen. We don't want the U.S. military operating domestically. We don't want intelligence operations, from, for example, the CIA going on against American citizens, all of those kinds of things. China blends all of that together. So that's why you can have something that looks like a fishing vessel and may even be a fishing company, but actually does military, responds to military taskings. And all across the spectrum, they have this that we call civil military fusion, and we don't know how to respond to that. That's why China is what we call a gray zone operator. They recognize that because we have these neat categories, they can exploit the space in the middle.
So right now, the U.S. has pretty significant presence in South Korea, in Japan, and historically the Philippines. I think the U.S. is actually building up more right now in the Philippines. Taiwan, obviously, as you said, we're kind of saying we're going to help you, but on conditions that aren't really clear right now. Of those 3 countries, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, do you think that's why China's pushing the most effort there right now? Because the U.S. has strongly aligned themselves with South Korea and Japan. So they're saying, hey, we're going to back off there. We're going to focus on the Philippines until the U.S. pushes too hard, and then we'll go find somewhere else they can push out.
Well, so they're pushing in all places, right? So we recently did a story a couple of weeks ago where we broke the news that China had essentially something that looks like a huge oil rig out in what's called the Provisional Measures Zone in the Yellow Sea, which is, again, a classic gray zone tactic. It's there to help with aquaculture. They want to breed salmon deep in the sea, which is probably a perfectly legitimate activity. And yet, it's never simple with China, right? By putting this huge structure there, basically a big jackup rig, it's establishing a presence. It's establishing an island that's not an island, right? And so with Japan, of course, there are regular incidents. In fact, just one this past week around the Senkaku Islands, which are disputed between China and Japan. So they are pushing in all places. What has made the Philippines stand out is that the Philippines really decided to push back hard starting early in 2023. And this was a change from the previous 6 years under their previous president, Rodrigo Duterte, who's one of whose defining characteristics going back decades was that he hated the United States with a white-hot passion, and so tried very hard to build a friendship with China. And that didn't necessarily go, I think, in the way that he thought it would. He didn't get all the investment that he thought he was going to get, and he still got aggression in the South China Sea, in the Philippines exclusive economic zone. So President Marcos came in, and 6 months in, he essentially leaned into this policy of what we have called at Sea Light assertive transparency, which is we're going to go out in our ships and aircraft and look at what's going on in our exclusive economic zone and around our occupied features and take a lot of pictures and bring along embedded reporters and let the world see. And China decided that this was a public embarrassment that needed to be punished, and spent well over a year punishing the Philippines, and really to some degree is still punishing the Philippines. Now, they remain concerned about South Korea, but South Korea is in the middle of an election cycle and may elect a president more to their liking, so they'll probably be a little more modest right now. They picked their spots, But the Philippines in particular, by sort of sticking its neck out a little bit, which they really had to do in order just to sort of build some national resilience and get some international support, has been paying a heavy price.
So we've got a free media in the U.S. with obvious challenges, but it's very clearly more open than it is in China. And one of the continued favorite targets of the media is to criticize sitting presidents for their policies internationally, right? Whether it's Biden or it's Trump, there's a lot of critique about what they're doing. How would you categorize, like, what would be your biggest critique on President Xi? What are some of the mistakes that you think that he's making in the region?
Well, so President Xi's probably the thing that he will be noted for, well, depending on how history goes, but he essentially was the pivot point from going from what we used to call hide and bide, hide your capabilities, bide your time, right, to really what I might call shout and flout, right? Let everybody know exactly who you are and what you're going to do. And so China under President Xi has decided that now is China's time, and it can, in many ways, sort of come out of its shell and sort of exert itself internationally. And I think that President Xi, partly because, of course, he can only be in charge for so long. Eventually, the actuarial tables take over, and he can't be in charge anymore. But also because perhaps China looks at a window of opportunity where they see China's capabilities sort of apexing or peaking, and look out longer term and see problems with demographics and debt and other issues. And they have decided that now is the time. So I think that's probably, that's where the question would be, right? Was it necessary? So if I've got President Xi's ambitions and I want China to be essentially the world's preeminent power, is ending hide and bide, was that the right move? Or should you have just let that run for several more decades? Why push it? Why, you were getting everything you wanted very quietly, but by deciding to essentially, turn up the volume and move forward, now you have united your adversaries against you. You've seen the U.S. allies begin to make relationships with one another. Now everybody's got reciprocal access agreements for their military forces all along Japan, the Philippines, Australia. All of these countries are coming together in a way that's going to make your job harder, where you possibly could have just been, done that gray zone thing quietly and continued to let things fall into your lap.
So there's 3 other countries in the region that are literally bordering the area, which is Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. I believe the U.S. is probably the strongest with Vietnam, mostly for manufacturing right now. But Malaysia and Indonesia don't really make the news much in this situation. Do you think, and clearly there's a lot of reasons for that, but do you think the U.S. is going to try and strengthen relationships there at all? Or are they just kind of try and deal with what they have going on?
Well,
is?
I mean, the U.S. is constantly trying to strengthen those relationships. I would say what sort of sets those two countries apart, and by the way, there's a third one that nobody ever talks about because they essentially don't do anything about anything, which is Brunei. They just sort of, they know that the Chinese are in their exclusive economic zone and they just don't care. They've kind of made their deal. But Malaysia and Indonesia, especially Malaysia right now, has sort of calculated that the threat to them is not as severe, right? And that's true, right? They are further south. In fact, one of the interesting little vignettes I have is recently I was down in Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia, for a South China Sea conference. And the first panel featured a Chinese diplomat. And because I was on the third panel, I wasn't on the first panel, I had to ask a question from the floor. And so I asked my question to the Chinese diplomat. I said, does China's claim of indisputable sovereignty over the Spratly Islands include the 5 Spratly Islands currently occupied by Malaysia? And I asked that question 3 times, exactly in a row because he didn't answer it, and he never actually did. He doesn't want to answer it because Malaysia is kind of doing everything China wants for the most part right now. Their Prime Minister Anwar is essentially as being as low key and almost obsequious as possible, just to sort of let the Philippines absorb all the blows. Now Vietnam has got a totally different strategy. They've been reaching out to China sort of through party to party talks, but at the same time, we talked about China's island building campaign. The biggest island building campaign by far right now in the world, by orders of magnitude, is Vietnam. They are aggressively building out their own features in the South China Sea, turning them into military bases. And China doesn't seem to be reacting too much to this, interestingly. And I think China has essentially made the calculation that, okay, we've got the U.S. allies. We're going to focus in on them. That's the real threat. Vietnam, what they're doing is a pain, but we don't want to sort of complicate our lives too much. So Vietnam has sort of taken advantage of this moment in history, whereas if they'd done this maybe a little bit earlier or even little bit later, they might have got a lot more pushback from Beijing and had a lot more problems.
I'm also in the Vietnam case, it's interesting because I'm doing some manufacturing in China, and multiple factories that I've been talking to in China actually also have factories in Vietnam, and they're working closely together to be able to evade tariffs. And there's a lot of connection there on the business front it is very interesting.
So I did 3 years in Hanoi at the U.S. Embassy there. I was the second U.S. air attaché to Vietnam after, of course, we normalized relations with them. So they have a very interesting relationship to China. They're, of course, their greatest partner. They had a comprehensive strategic partnership with them before anybody else. At the same time, if you walk down the streets of Hanoi, every other street is named after somebody who fought the Chinese over 1,000 years, right? So they are very, in some senses, very clear-eyed at who their primary adversary is. It is China. It is beyond a shadow of a doubt. Even though they recognize that they recently fought the United States in a war, they kind of look back at that as kind of this temporary unpleasantness that is way in the past now. And I never felt unwelcome there as long as I was there. In fact, I very much felt they really wanted U.S. engagement because they needed something to help them push back against China's aggression.
I want to shift north a little bit because we haven't really talked about what's going on in the Korean Peninsula. It's also another one that reaches the U.S. in terms of reporting, but maybe it's not as top of mind right now as what's going on in Taiwan. But a big surprise happened this last year. And towards the end of the year, I think it was December 3rd, there was a very surprising moment in South Korea. Maybe for our listeners, could you break down what happened in South Korea and what was kind of what happened on December 3rd? Why was it interesting and why was it surprising for you, somebody who studies the region?
Well, so I assume we're talking about the declaration of martial law by President Yoon, who was a very, if you will, U.S. friendly president. He was very hawkish on China. We had a lot of success dealing with him. And actually, one of the most interesting things that he was doing was trying to help normalize Korean relations with Japan, which had been extremely fraught and complicated going back, of course, to World War II. And so we were happy about all of that. But he was getting a lot of pushback from his opposition in Parliament and not getting his programs passed. And he responded to that at a certain point by declaring martial law. Well, this took everybody by surprise. It took us by surprise, us in the United States. It took his own party by surprise. He didn't seem to have a great plan for how this was going to solve his problems. And of course, what it did instead was it got him jailed and impeached and removed eventually. It took a little while for the whole thing to play out. And now what we're looking at is another Korean election. And There is a certain sense that the other party, the one that, say his previous president, Moon was, the president for, is more accommodating to China, and people in President Yoon's party are very, in some ways, a lot of them excused or rationalized his declaration of martial law essentially by saying, well, we can't let those other guys in because they're going to make deals with North Korea and China that'll undermine our national security. And this is clearly what those guys want. So that makes the whole thing very, very complicated. Now, in the end, of course, they're going to elect who they elect. They're a sovereign country and a democracy, and that's how these things work. And that's, if people look at us, we elect very different people every 4 years, and that throws everybody into a tizzy. So that's exactly what's going to happen in South Korea. They're going to elect who they want. But it is true that, China has figured out that it can leverage elections to get what it wants. It does try to influence them. I don't know how successful it is. Its penetration of a lot of the apparatus in Taiwan is currently getting a lot of attention. And of course, China would very much like to have a different administration in Taiwan, and I think believes that if it can sort of get to a more friendly administration, then it can start to pick off some of those things that it needs to kind of, complete its soft takeover.
So there's been a lot of talk from many military leaders around the world that China would not make a move on anything. And I know you've said that you don't think they would do it anyway before 2026. And Xi is not getting any younger. And maybe he has some personal, things he wants to do to be remembered in history. Do you think 2026 is that line? It's also the anniversary of China. It's a very sentimental time period to mark maybe their expanding of their empire. For you personally, do you have any forecasts specifically what they would do in 2026 or beyond?
So again, okay. So the original date that was sort of got all the attention, what was the one that was often called the Davidson window, which is 2027, and that was where former U.S. Indo-Pacific Command commander Admiral Phil Davidson told Congress that was the year that they thought was sort of the maximum threat. And that was because it was the year in which Xi had told his army essentially to be ready for war, and that the U.S. had assessed that this was about the time that China's capacity to invade Taiwan would be sort of at its apex. So, and there have actually been other dates thrown around. I'm actually interviewing General Mike Minahan tomorrow, who was sort of former retired Air Force general who, when he took over Air Mobility Command, told his commanders to be ready by 2025. And that letter was leaked to the press by somebody. And all of a sudden, that got all kinds of attention. So we are sort of in the window now where people worry about these things. Once again, I see it less as a point in time as a window or a process. And you already see it unfolding. You see it in these massive exercises that China is conducting around Taiwan. You see it in these all of these spies that are now being discovered in Taiwan, and actually in the Philippines. You're getting more and more of this. You're seeing new the creation of baselines around Scarborough Shoal. We were talking about these moves. These once again, each of these has a place in China's overall campaign to essentially create for itself its own sphere of influence, its own zone. Remember when China looks at the world and it says, this is the way the world is organized, the United States lucked out and became strong in a place and in a time where it could essentially have these two massive oceans and really no regional threats. Whereas China is surrounded by regional threats. It's got U.S. allies all over the place. It really has no strategic space that it thinks that as a great power it should have. So it looks at this and it basically thinks that this is very unfair. And so what it's essentially trying to do is create that strategic space, that anti-access area denial zone, and try to push the United States and ultimately convince the United States that we don't need to be over there. Just let China have theirs. We'll be over here happy in the Western Hemisphere. They've always looked at the world that way, that we have the West, they have the East. Why can't we just be happy? We get half the world, they get half the world. It works out fine for them. And so they're going to try to get to a place like that. But I think that, again, what they want to do is continue to sort of chip away at it rather than try to go and grab the whole thing.
One kind of last question for you here before we wrap up. So I lived in Macau in 2009 and spent a lot of time in Hong Kong, was there almost every week at the time playing sports and would spend a lot of time there. And I had a lot of friends who were expats. Pretty much all of them have left. You know, Hong Kong, you mentioned the Hong Kong model of China kind of slowly taking over and changing the culture into more of a mainland style model. What does that actually look like in practical terms in Taiwan? How do you think they would even accomplish that, given the fact that it's the difference between Hong Kong and Taiwan is that Taiwan's an island, and Hong Kong, they're right there connected on the border, and it's much easier to bring people in, bring in vehicles, whatever they need to undermine the society. What would that look like in Taiwan, given the fact that they're disconnected geographically?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things to keep in mind also about Taiwan is it's not just an island. It's actually many islands, and many of those, again, the much smaller ones, are actually very, very close to mainland China. So, the opportunities to sort of pick off this or that island through various stratagems I think it's something that probably, again, the way that this would happen, I think, is probably going to be one of those things that none of us have ever thought about, because China is great at those things. I was in Vietnam, as I said, during the time that China started its island building campaign. And one of the things that made the island building campaign so effective was it took everybody off guard. Nobody had a book on this. Nobody had envisioned what would happen if China took a bunch of reefs in the middle of the water and turned them into military bases. And our response, frankly, was feckless. We didn't have a response. And we essentially watched it happen. So, I think that China is probably thinking through, okay, there are targets that are easier to hit. There's lower hanging fruit. And what we need to do is we need to be able to make moves on these things that don't generate the level of response that sort of, that it keeps it sort of below that threshold of the pain that we can tolerate. So, if they are able to convince, say, a future government in Taiwan, why don't we do joint patrols of your restricted waters? We're there to help. We're there to help make sure that our fishermen are obeying all the laws. We can do the patrols with you, and say some future government says that sounds kind of reasonable. And then over time, it's, well, why don't we help you with the management of some of this trade that goes back and forth between these smaller islands close to our coast and the mainland? And we can make this easier on you. We can put some people in these islands to help the commerce flow. Just little steps. And again, and then what's the argument in Taiwan? Well, why make our lives difficult? All we have to do is give them this, and then our lives get to go on as we want, and everything's fine. And so, of course, that works for China. And I would be surprised, again, when they think of these things, they don't think in terms of strictly, this is military, this is civilian, this is peace, this is war. It's all a continuum. And the question is, what tools do you have in your tool belt anywhere on the continuum that sort of lets you sort of ratchet things up a little bit more and convince the people on the other side that this is their best deal? Why don't you just make it?
I'm reminded by the Reagan quote where he says that the most dangerous thing you can hear is, "We're from the government and we're here to help you." So
right.
that may be China's quote.
Chinese Communist Party, and we're here to help.
Yeah.
Ray, thank you so much for hopping on with us. Really appreciate it. And yeah, go check out. I mean, the best place. There's a couple places to look, but one of them is your Sea Light blog, and then your podcast, which is titled
"Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?" And I
Ray,
usually say it
so
exactly like that.
Thank you, Ray.
Man, I love episodes like this, diving in with somebody who has spent so much time thinking about the complicated relationships that are happening in a place so far removed from the U.S. And, Ray's interesting because he's really been involved in this for years. I think he spent about 35 years in the Air Force and has lived in different parts of Asia. Like he mentioned, being living in Vietnam, and really understands what's going on the ground there. What were some of your biggest takeaways from the conversation with Ray?
Well, you obviously lived in Macau. I've spent a lot of time in mainland China, in Hong Kong, and really all over Asia. And it's one of those places where, as an outsider, it's very interesting, right? It's great food, it's great culture, and you get there and you go, wow, this is a lot different than I ever thought it would be. And so listening to what he has to say, you kind of get this bigger picture idea that we really don't know what China is going to do next. And we also don't know how these other countries are going to react. Of course, from a U.S. perspective, we want things to go a certain way. We were crossing our fingers and wishing for certain things. It's highly unlikely that we're going to get what we want. And, bringing it to present day with what's going on with the tariffs and Trump and all these countries basically realigning how they do trade with each other. We talked about what's next, 2026, 2027. Is China going to make a move? We don't know what's going to happen at all, but we do know that, the ball's in motion. Things are changing quick right now.
Yeah, I'm very interested if we're going to be able to land the plane and make some sort of a, grand bargain between the U.S. and China. It's, I think at the core, right, that's what Trump and the Trump administration wants. They want to get to a new normal that involves more of like a win-win type relationship. But whether or not we get there is, I think there's a lot of room for error. And I think a lot of what they want is different than what we want.
Right.
So,
win-win is relative, right? Win-win for us or win-win for them. I think they have a different perspective.
I think at the core of the Trump administration, there's this belief that it's like win-lose right now and that we're losing. And all the rhetoric reflects, the U.S. is losing in trade to China. So we'll see.
One interesting article came out, I think the Wall Street Journal this past week, was they were talking about the statistics that China has stopped producing over the past several years. So like in 2022, they stopped producing certain real estate and property trends. Then they stopped producing some monetary numbers. Then they stopped producing some demographic numbers. Correct. And it's fallen off a cliff the past several years. And we just don't know. When I say we, outsiders, and a lot of people are speculating that China's in real trouble internally as far as their demographics, but economically. So what could be happening internally is completely different than what we actually think is going on. It could be really bad. Maybe they're really big in trouble right now, and perhaps there's some sort of a collapse, maybe in a small scale or large scale over the coming years. Or it could be the complete opposite. Or they just stopped producing numbers because they really are getting ready to make a military move. I don't know which one it is, but I do know that the trend that has been more or less set in stone since, let's say, the early 2000s till a couple years ago, it's changing quick.
There's a great book by Jared Diamond, who he wrote a very famous book called, I think it was called Germs. What is it? Germs and Steel. What's that book called? Something like Blood, Germs and Steel, or Guns. You know what I'm talking about?
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. So he wrote this book. Then he wrote a second book that was about kind of the future of America and China, and he talks a lot about democracy versus autocracy, and as he studied the way that these countries that have been more autocratic fall, it's nothing then all at once. And he's like, democracy, there's a lot of gridlock, and you'll look at it and it's very messy, and you'll see periods where nothing seems to happen. I feel like we've been in that period for a long time where like no changes seem to happen, and then they align and things happen quickly. Where his argument is on the autocratic side, you see lots of changes all the time, but when things go bad, they go bad incredibly quickly because there's no gridlock. There's nothing to stop it from going off a cliff. And yeah, I'm very interested to see where that goes, and if the pressure.
There's this saying that democracy gets in the way of progress, but there's kind of beauty in that. And what you're suggesting is the U.S. has this kind of grinding government that's very frustrating for a lot of onlookers, but it was designed that way. It was designed by the founding fathers to have this kind of grind to prevent what you're talking about, which is the fall of the USSR, the fall of China nearly a century ago, and these new leaders coming up and going a different direction. The progress happens quickly, but the fall can happen even faster.
And one of his main arguments is like, you don't see famines that wipe out millions of people in true democratic countries because, well, they'll just shift their policy. But you'll see that, I mean, it's no secret that it's happened in China and it's happened in Russia, both places with these communist governments that led to massive negative consequences down the road. I think it's fascinating. I hope you guys learned something from this episode. And yeah, maybe we'll see as the year unfolds, less surprises as you'll be more briefed on what's coming down the pipe. We'll talk to you guys on the next episode.